all remaining value of representable property. 5. And all commensurable obligations to redeem the circulation in representative property. And of course, we go on to prove that mathematically perfected economy is the only process which in truth accomplishes all these objects. In fact, even without even any regulation, owing merely to an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment. So the people become the true masters of the economy. We ourselves, by need to monetize, dictate the currency in circulation. We become the only truly free markets and the only truly free enterprise. 2. Only such an immutable currency is absolutely bereft of possible offense against anyone. A. Because its very quantity and disposition never deny anyone of evidence of, and therefore ability to purchase, just reward for determinably like production. And of course, we are the determiners. We're allowed to decide what the value of our work is and to agree, both buyer and seller, both, on a price. And the buyer, of course, is allowed to exercise their right to issue an enforceable promissory obligation and to pay that off to retire principal at the rate of payment or consumption at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the property. So only such an immutable currency is absolutely bereft of possible offense against anyone, because its very quantity and disposition never deny anyone of evidence of, and therefore ability to purchase, just reward for determinably like production. Because its very quantity and disposition always suffice to fulfill commitments, and because its very quantity and free disposition alone are always redeemable in represented property without possibility of unwarranted systemic denial or dispossession. Nothing but a fully disposable, perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just so much for the remaining value of represented property, therefore, can secure the vital purposes of monetary justice. 3. Therefore, any deviation from these knowable requisites is to endow a power to perpetrate offense. And in its inherent infliction of injustice, therefore, any purposed or even purportedly incidental deviation from these objects is a criminal offense, destructive not only to the monetary system itself, but to its obligations, to its vital properties of representation, and potentially then to the possession of either money or property by every subject. Thus is disproportion and maldisposition, or dedication of evermore of a circulation to servicing an escalated sum of falsified debt, as disproportion and maldisposition are the only monetary means of perpetrating offense, the only perfect currency and circulation shall all at once represent the natural diminishment in remaining value of all wealth, while at all times remaining fully disposable to this very purpose. Only a currency and circulation meeting these requisites without exception, not only overall, but in the consideration of every affected individual, therefore, which is, if I might break in here, is the offense of spending money into circulation. Yes, you can eventually, by manipulations of the state, which of course are undesirable, you can manipulate a circulation which is inflation and deflation free, but you don't accomplish it within respect to every individual, because if our newlywed couple wants to buy a new house which doesn't exist yet, the producer of the home is denied the circulation to do so, and so is the newlywed couple, which in effect finances the home. So this is these are offenses against us, and which comprise a fact of non-solution, because in fact you're causing these problems, and you're only asserting that, well, once they're realized, we can remedy them by introducing further circulation. But this doesn't remedy them, because now the newlywed couple would have to earn that money from existent circulation, which is only introduced by financing further redundant government infrastructure, merely to get the money into circulation, but it's not put into the hands of the newlywed couple, and who can't have earned it already. So this right to issue promissory obligations is critical to realizing the prosperity that we are capable of. So our final point of Section A is only a currency and circulation meeting these requisites without exception, not only overall, but in the consideration of every affected individual, therefore, can at all times sustain a commerce comprised strictly of free, just trade of all wealth, justly rewarding production its respective share of all available wealth. B. Promissory obligations are the only suitable vehicle for justly monetizing and conveying trade of our production. What we're doing here is we are proving that promissory obligations are actually the only rational vehicle for monetizing our production, for the very reasons that we've just stated in our commentary. B. The only suitable vehicle for justly monetizing and conveying trade of our production, therefore, is the promissory obligation. 1. Because every unit of a just representative currency must retire in accord with the life cycle of the represented property, which is in accord with the very definition of a promissory obligation. Every unit of a just currency must retire in accord with the life cycle of the represented property, because this and this alone is what maintains our perpetual one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that for that remaining value of represented property, or to redeem the property for just that much circulation. So these are the only tools available, and they are conclusive tools which cement the value of the circulation to the only facts they can be cemented to, and which they must be cemented to in order to achieve an immutable currency. So, to begin again, the only suitable vehicle for justly monetizing and conveying trade of our production, therefore, is the promissory obligation. Because every unit of a just representative currency must retire in accord with the life cycle of the represented property. Because the rightful bearer of the resultant cost is the obligor, who consumes of the respective property, and because an unlimited supply of virtually costless tokens of value has no power whatever to impede the objects of a just circulation, either by incompatible quantity or unnecessary cost. Owing to inherently disparate volumes, it is mathematically impossible, therefore, any permutation of a precious metal monetary standard for any differing set or subset of material or immaterial value, or for any adulteration of the natural life cycle of the natural obligations of promissory commitments to meet the requisites of a just, immutable currency. All such contrary standards, therefore, are hereby repealed. C. Inherently compatible life cycle of promissory obligations. The natural life cycle of promissory obligations is singularly, inherently consistent with the objects of a just currency in circulation. Because to maintain a circulation which is consistent with the remaining value of represented property, and thus which is consistent with every actual creditor and obligor's interests in a mutable value of the resultant currency, promissory obligations must be paid as retires principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property. Moreover, should an obligor pay less than the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, then they shall have taken from the pool of wealth as denies others of just reward. And should an obligor of their own volition pay more than the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, no consequence exists if and only if equity is interchangeable with and thus comprises an effectual volume of the entire effective circulation. An effective circulation, therefore, is necessarily comprised both of unfulfilled promissory obligations and of equity, which, in order to fulfill a requisite sum of evident reward, must always be convertible into further respective promissory obligations. D. Inherent value of promissory obligations. Promissory obligations are inherent representations of value, incumbent in an enforceable promise to pay some eventual determinable equivalent of the value of the property they originally tokenize. While an indispensable requisite for virtually costless tokenization of value is met by the properties of natural, unexploited promissory obligations, no real possibility of enforcement of the integrity of representation can truly exist, however, but in a circulation which is both equivalent and fully disposable to the represented property. These requisites too then force us to eradicate interest to deliver upon the objects of circulatory integrity. E. Inherent obligation to retire payment of the principal of promissory obligations. I might add that, there are certain skeptical people that don't realize that these things amount to a literal mathematic proof, that all the questions are answered within this same document. But yet it's meant to be such a thing. And so, while it doesn't follow necessarily the simple train of thinking in a mathematic proof of each individual item, it does deviate from a mere linear path merely because we have so many things which relate backwardly and forwardly within all of this, that this is in fact a very logical structure to present the proof, and in fact in these very expressions. Contest that as you will. Inherent obligation to retire payment of the principal of promissory obligations. Because the value of promissory obligations is incumbent in an enforceable obligation to pay equivalent value, the value of promissory obligations, therefore, ceases in fulfillment of the obligation by payment of the principal, which payments, therefore, are only rightly retired from circulation. Paid principal, therefore, no longer can rightfully represent or convey value. Any entity properly executing any account of payment, therefore, retires paid principal from circulation. Nor then can paid principal ever duly represent or be possessed as if it were equivalent to the rightful property of anyone. F. True creditors give up property for promissory obligations. The only true creditors in this vital arrangement give up property for promissory obligations. True creditors, therefore, have an indispensable interest in an immutable currency, for any decline in the value of currency is an offense against their entitlement. To merely publish and or issue evidence of promissory obligations, therefore, is absolutely not to issue credit. For in giving up no lawful consideration of commensurable value to a purported debt, no actual debt can rightly exist to a mere publisher or mere